What's up, y'all? Welcome to Better on the Inside, a podcast about working for a church without losing your soul. My name is John, and I am your host and digital pastor. Hey, for this episode, I get to hang out with Holly Tate and have a delightful conversation about changing toxic leadership culture, healthy growth, her own story, and being a woman in ministry. In fact, it was so good, we talked for so long that we're going to have to do two parts, and so this is part one. Holly is the SVP for Growth for an organization called Leadr. It's a really cool tech company who's doing their part to make churches better on the inside. It's really great. I met her for the first time at an event that Leadr hosted, and she's such a smart and dynamic person that I was like, yo, I need to have her on the podcast. And if her voice sounds familiar to you like it did for me, it's because Holly was the host of the Vanderbloemen podcast for several years when she was part of that organization, did amazing work there. If you work at ministry or volunteer at your church, or even if you got burned out and left organized religion altogether, it's a really good conversation. It's about restoring goodness and health to the spiritual communities that we love. All right, love y'all. Enjoy the episode. Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm here with Holly Tate, the Senior Vice President of Growth for Leadr. More importantly than her title, she's just an awesome person. So welcome to Better on the Inside, Holly.
Thanks for having me, John. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, and so before we get to like super serious stuff, I followed you, on socials and all that before all this. You were on the Vanderbloemen podcast. If you recognize her voice, right? And we met at a Leadr event, and I was like, Holly is like the most delightful person. And so she's definitely somebody that I want to talk to about this kind of stuff.
Well, thanks, John. You're super fun to talk to, too. It was so fun to meet you in person a few weeks ago. And I'm just so honored that you asked me to be a part of your podcast. So glad that you're doing this. It takes guts and courage and a time commitment for sure to do a podcast. So I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, tons of fun. Here we go. Back in the podcast game. Holly Tate, back on the horse. So as we talked about, part of the focus on the show is how to serve at a church, work for a church, volunteer for a church without losing your soul, without completely like giving up on your spiritual growth. Are you somebody that I call like a leadership and culture kind of expert? At least that's how I view you. And so I know that you've worked in this space for a while. You worked in church workplace cultures and things like that. Like, what are some of the things that you've seen that are bad in good cultures for spiritual growth from the inside?
Oh, yes. So first of all, I love this topic of from the inside because that's where we learn, right? We got to pull back the curtain, be vulnerable, be honest with each other. I think to answer your question, where we see cultures that are toxic or unhealthy, it's where there's a lot of dishonesty as a part of the culture. And that starts from the top. If we don't have leaders who are leading with humility and with vulnerability, and they're, projecting ego or selfishness, like that trickles down to the entire team. And so that's probably the foundation of what I see is number one starts at the top. And to put it simply, like healthy leaders build healthy teams and healthy teams build healthy organizations. It's not rocket science, but it's also not easy. So
yeah, right. It's simple, but it's not easy.
Yes.
Oh, that's so good. And you talked about honesty. You talked about vulnerability. You talked about some really great things. What are some of the things that people can do when they feel like they're in a culture where the leader might not be vulnerable, or you feel a distance, or there's not a focus on folks' spiritual growth that are kind of on the inside? Because part of what you just talked about is this thing that we can do in our churches that we're so good at, of like platforming leaders, where it's like, you're up here, we're down here. And a lot of those leaders are well-intentioned, good people who might even be honest people generally, who might even be good shepherds and spiritual growth folks, but there's some kind of separation. And so for the folks that are maybe in a culture where they don't feel the vulnerability, maybe they don't feel the honesty, and not even saying the person's dishonest, but they don't feel that transparency and honesty. What can a person do that's in that kind of culture?
It's a great question and not an easy one. So I can't wait to dig into that. But you said something as a part of this question that was really key that I think is worth spending some time on. And what you said was, we're really good at platforming people, especially our pastors and our speakers, because we're in this like really strange time where anyone and everyone can have a platform if they want to, right? Like, and for free. I mean, we've never been at a time in history where you can open an Instagram account and post whatever you want and find your tribe online easier than ever and build a platform out of it. And it's amazing. Right. Like we have incredible resources at our fingertips to connect with people around the globe, tell amazing stories, reach people with the gospel. But at the same time, if we're not careful, it can also destroy people and our churches and our organizations. And we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that right now. I think the deconstruction of some of that is really healthy, honestly. And I think especially the younger generation is really eager to see some of that deconstruction happening as they desire real connection. I think that's a misconception that we have. Like we're hearing right now, a lot of the trends I'm seeing from thought leaders in the church space are saying like virtual's where it's at. Like we're not ever going to have the traditional church again, like metaverse. And like, yes, I think that all of these resources that are at our fingertips, we should be using and exploring because there are further ways to connect with people. But let's not forget that connecting with people is the whole purpose of it. It's not to have a magical platform or to boost our egos or to gain followers. Like it's to connect with the hearts of people. And I think if we really pay attention to Generation Z and what they're yearning for, and even, I mean, Generation Z is already in the workforce. Let's look at, I think they're, Alpha as the next generation after them. The yearn for deep relationship is so real right now. They're the most connected generation than ever online, but they also are the most lonely and isolated generation. And so I think it's critical that we as church leaders really spend time thinking about what that means for the future of the church. And so I just wanted to, that's a little bit of a soapbox for me. So
girl, get on your soapbox. That's why you go to a podcast. Get on the soapbox.
That's right. That should be what my podcast should be called, is like Holly's Soapbox. That would be,
I love it.
The Soapbox with Holly Tate. That would have like 1 million episodes. But anyway, to answer.
Okay, I'm signing on. I'm in.
That's awesome. But to answer your question, what can you do when you're a little farther down on the org chart and you see toxicity higher up? Number one, I think the best thing we can do is try to lead ourselves and the people and in our sphere of influence really, really well. So I think it starts there. If we're calling out leaders above us that are unhealthy, but we're not healthy ourselves, that's a problem. So I think number one is prioritizing, okay, I'm seeing these things in other people, but where am I dropping the ball? Where am I not leading myself and my team well? So let's start there first. Really find a mentor, get some friends that are honest with you, ask for 360 feedback from different people who are on your team or peers or above you, right? Lead with that honesty and vulnerability that you desire to see higher up in the org chart. Really starts there. Secondly, it's important to have that conversation. And this can be so scary. And unfortunately, I think what I see in a lot of churches is an unhealthy relationship with feedback. So there's a lot of fear when we want to bring up hard and difficult conversations. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be the opposite. Like our church staff should be the safest place for us to be honest and vulnerable with each other. That's literally what we're called as the church to be, is a safe place for people to come as they are and feel loved, the love of Jesus, right? I mean, we see that in Jesus's life. Like he was spending time with people that no one else would. Yet we often create staff cultures at our churches where people are coming to work and they can't feel like they don't feel like they can bring their full selves to work.
Yes.
That's a problem. Yeah.
Woo! Okay,
I know.
get on that soapbox, Holly. That's an unhealthy relationship with feedback. Like, that is such a succinct and precise way to say it. That is so good. It was hard for me to like not just get excited and start moving when you were talking, because it's like, if you can't bring your whole self to work, how can you lead anybody else to do that?
Yeah. No, you
And
can't.
you create contradiction within yourself when you do that. And having talked to leaders who feel hypocritical or in a difficult place, and trying to have empathy for the toxic leader, right? Of like the people that are maybe leading a toxic culture. A lot of times it's from this contradiction within of, I can't come to work vulnerable, so I've created a space where nobody else is vulnerable. So your advice is excellent of, if you're lower on the org chart, like, you got to get healthy yourself, and you got to have the conversation.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to keep it inside. And so I didn't think we would necessarily go here, but let me just speak from my church staff experience of a painful church experience. And I'm still at this church right now, and it's kind of public knowledge, but a painful church experience where I felt like I felt unheard, and I felt like, that things weren't going the way that I wanted to, and that, it was toxic and it was bad. And I at first approached it in a solution-oriented way of going, well, let me pitch this to us, and we should do this with the org chart, and we should do this, and what if we organize like this? And there was a consultant in the room who was just like, John, what are you feeling? And it was one of the most embarrassing things that's ever happened to me. I'm sitting there with the elders and the senior leaders of our church, and I just start bawling.
Oh, yeah.
I just started bawling of like, you guys didn't look out for us. Like, I didn't feel like you took care of us as leaders. And that's what I was really feeling. I came with solutions, and I'm like, how am I crying in front of the elders right now? How am I doing this? It's super embarrassing. But here's the thing. What I can say is that things changed. Like, we've moved on from that previous kind of thing, which is good. But even before that, having just said my piece and given the feedback, I felt freed from a lot of the burden.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't like it was like magic, everything is fine because you think, we all think of the Disney ending of just like, I gave the feedback and everything changed, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, your responsibility isn't to change it, it's just to speak to it. And so once I spoke to it and shared how I felt, and in a super embarrassing way, it doesn't have to be that embarrassing for everybody, in a super embarrassing way, it was like, oh my gosh, I feel free from that because I did my responsibility. And so your words like resonate significantly with me to give the feedback, but work on being healthier yourself as well.
So good. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, John. And what a beautiful example of you being vulnerable. And I know I've been there when you just like can't hold back the tears anymore. But tears are it's just a physical example of what we're feeling on the inside. And so for your elders and that consultant and the other leaders in the room to really see that was what you were feeling is critical to them understanding the heaviness that you were carrying. And so, way to go. I mean, you could have just said like, oh, I'm fine, and not spoke that truth into reality, but you did. And that took courage.
Yeah. Well, I love that I asked to interview you and you're like totally hosting the podcast for me, which is amazing. But okay. So just to unpack that experience just a little bit, like, it would have been easy to be like, you're not listening to my strategic solution.
Yeah.
So I wasn't heard. And I think, in full credit to our elders and our leadership at that moment, their whole reaction was like, we had no idea.
Yeah.
And it was, nobody was malicious. Nobody was, and you can create narratives in your head. Why this is happening, nobody cares. Nobody wants to do anything about it. Nobody sees me. Nobody sees what's going on. Blah, blah, blah. And it's easy to get like discontent about that. But like vomiting vulnerability in this case of just like, bleh, it's all coming out. It made people go, we had no idea. And that was like, oh, I think I'd assigned some things in my head. Like, I think I had some preconceptions and some judgments of how this was going to go and what you were doing. And that wasn't true at all. And so the vulnerability kind of dealt with that. So
absolutely, John. And I've been there too. Like there are definitely times in my own, when I think back, like in my career so far, there's been times where I haven't said things to leaders out of fear when the reality is now that, I'm in an executive role of a very fast growing organization. We're hiring, we have 10 new people starting at Leadr on Monday. It's so exciting.
Awesome. Yeah.
It's so exciting. But what that means is the bigger our teams get, the more removed leaders get from the frontline employees. And so it can be a really lonely place as an executive leader. And I think for the individual contributors or the lower level managers who are listening, what you just shared is a great example of like, we had no idea. So when you're frustrated, when you're feeling those feelings of not being heard, to try to assume the best. I often assume the worst when I really should stop, take a breath and go, you know what? I'm sure my leader, desires the best for this organization and for me as an individual and for my team. I just need to take a second and communicate what I'm feeling and what I'm seeing with respect, right? Not in a nasty way or a disrespectful way. And most of the time, unless they're just completely unhealthy, but most of the time, that leader is going to be so grateful that you shared that because they're not seeing what you're seeing. And so would just encourage to have that conversation. And I guess when you hear advice from someone like me on a podcast that's like, have that difficult conversation, it's like, okay, Holly, but where do I start? So if I could just give a really practical step, I think two things. One, if you're struggling with broaching the conversation with a leader who doesn't naturally lead with honesty and vulnerability, I think a really great place to start in a one-on-one meeting with them, just to ask them like, hey, who are your mentors? Who do you go to? And you could even start with saying with yourself, like, so let's role play this a little bit, John. If you were my executive leader, I might say, hey, John, I've been thinking a lot about me looking for a mentor. I would really like to find somebody who has been an executive team member, leading a marketing team at a tech company before. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And that made me think for you, John, like, who are some of the mentors in your life or people that you go to when you're stuck? And just listen to what that leader says. So if they don't have an answer, that's a really good indicator to you that they might not be receiving that honest feedback from people that they trust in their life. Yeah. But if they have great answers to that, like, oh yeah, it's this elder on our elder board, or it's this executive that that goes to our church, or this person that I've been going to, or a counselor that I see, like that could be a really good indicator for you of like, okay, it sounds like this person has some trusted advisors in their life that they're going to be able to help you feel a little bit more safe when you're having those conversations with that person. And then I think a second question to ask would be, hey, John, I've noticed a few things on our team recently that as a leader of a team, or if you're not even leading a team, as an individual contributor on our team that really believes in this mission, and I work here because I believe in the mission of our church, I wanted to share a few things I'm seeing to see if you're seeing it too. May I share those with you? And ask for that permission, right? I don't know any leader that would say, no, I don't want to hear those things.
Yeah, right.
And so once they say yes, then come with that list of like, here's the observations that I'm noticing, and just present them as observations. You don't have to come with solutions or accusations immediately, but just start with, hey, here are 3 observations that I've noticed. Are you seeing that too? That is going to be a great way for you to start that conversation that can feel really scary, in a way that comes with humility and vulnerability, so that hopefully you're creating that environment with your leader, and can create that conversation in a safe way. So that's just a little practical 2 different questions there that you can start.
Those are so good though, because if I'm a volunteer listening to this and I'm a random volunteer at Church X, doesn't matter how big it is, doesn't matter whatever, it's like, how can I even lead up? I mean, some of what you're talking about is leading up, but you've kind of come up with incredibly just some gentle ways of, one is coming from you're coming from curiosity of like, who's mentoring you? And the other one is finding common ground in observations, because so often, one, you're kind of using some judo on the leader for the observation one, to be like, do you want to hear the observation? And if the leader's like, no, it's like, okay, then you're definitely wrong and unhelpful.
Yes. Yes.
But like you said, most leaders will be like, yes, even if they don't really want to hear it.
Yep.
And so you use that, and for lack of a better term, like feedback judo, leadership judo, then you can share the observations, but you're not sharing them with judgment or opinion even really attached of like, this is where we need to go. It's just like, this is what I've seen. And I feel like most leaders that I've worked with, most people would be like, oh, you know what? I've noticed that too. And I have no idea what to do about it.
Right. Exactly.
Right. I've been ignoring that, and it creates common ground where even though you're technically the one with less power, right? Mm-hmm. You're coming into this flipped power dynamic, but you're inviting the leader in to a healthier conversation. Mm-hmm. And so that is so good. Like, this is like $1 million advice, Holly. This is so awesome.
Oh, you can send the check to my house. No, just kidding. Yeah. Just kidding.
Hey, everybody, Holly's Venmo, we'll drop it in the thing. I didn't say I was going to pay the $1 million for it, just to be clear. But it's wonderful advice that I think people can really embrace, and it's doable. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when I hear people give advice, my first thing is to be like, well, of course, you're a senior vice president. Right. Well, of course. And people in our organization say it to me all the time. Of course, you're an associate pastor. You can take this risk. You can do that. But I'm making a lot less, and I'm a lot less established. And so this is just like super practical advice that anybody can take that's not going to get you fired. Yes. It's having the right conversation that's not going to get you fired, or like, because I think a lot of people think they have to have like an I Am Spartacus moment. That's a really old movie for anybody that's like, it's way before us. But it's like that you have to stand up and be like, I'm taking the whole thing on. I'm going to be the whistleblower. And it's like, really, it seems like it's more conversations like this that start to change that kind of culture to be better on the inside.
Exactly. You nailed it, John. Absolutely.
Golly, Holly. So I could talk to you all day. Honestly, you're one of the easiest persons to talk to. So what about your personal experience with this? So we've talked a little bit about your work expertise and what that looks like. Like, what has been your experience in church world as it relates to your spiritual growth?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing is kind of what we already talked about, where when we have these cultures of where there's not a safe place to be open and honest about how our spiritual health is, then it's really hard to address it, right? And so we, a lot of times as church leaders, we feel like we can't admit, hey, I'm having doubts about my faith, or I'm revisiting this thing that I always grew up thinking was true, but now I'm not so sure, or I want to unpack this part of scripture. We feel like we have to have all the answers. And so, I feel like that a lot of the time. I mean, there's, you just said something that I thought was so interesting. We were like, well, of course, Holly, you're a senior vice president. I feel impostor syndrome every single day. I mean, because I've never been an SVP never been an SVP before, and not an SVP of a tech company before. And so there's, things that I'm facing on a daily basis that I have no idea what to do about it. And if I don't have the courage, because I really believe it takes courage, it's really hard for me to be vulnerable. That is it takes a lot of energy for me to, I'm great at encouraging other people to be vulnerable. But when it comes to me asking for help and admitting that I don't know an answer, that's hard. And so I have to actively practice that. And I've had situations in the past where I have been vulnerable and I feel like, and it wasn't safe, which is probably why I have a hard time with that. And so for me to assume the best about my leader and leaders in my life, to be open and honest, ask for help so that I can get that help I need. And you just have to have reps under your belt of going, okay, I survived. I asked for help and it was okay. And I actually got the help I needed, and I'm still in my role, and I didn't get fired, you know? So to have those reps under our belt are really, really important. And I think for any leaders that are listening, and this is where, you know, when you ask about my own experience in this, one thing I've learned in leading teams is there's been times where I've assumed that I've created environments where it was safe for people to be open and honest. And then, like, I'll never forget one time I had somebody that was on my team, and she was phenomenal, and we worked together for a long time. And we were really good friends too. And so I just thought, like, of course she would come to me if there was anything that I could do better, or that she was unhappy with, or, you know, anything like that. But when she left her role, one thing she shared with me was, you know, Holly, you're so good at seeing what could be better that you often don't celebrate the wins enough, which can make the people on your team feel defeated, like they're not winning, because I know. And so it was like, oh my goodness, I wish that I would have asked that years before, you know, because the fact that she was sharing that, and that I had created an environment where she didn't feel valued or didn't know where she was winning, made me so sad, right? Because I just thought that she was incredible, and, you know, she is incredible and was doing an amazing job, but I clearly wasn't communicating that enough. And so I think a leadership lesson in that is the moment that you think you're over communicating or asking the right questions means that you're probably just beginning to communicate enough. Like the moment when you're like, oh yeah, well, I've already, you know, asked that 3 times. Well, you should probably ask it 30 more times, you know? That is because, and you said this earlier in our talk, like you had that conversation with yourself in your head a million times. So it felt like you had communicated it. It felt like you had talked about how you were feeling, but really they had no idea. And it's because we have the conversation with ourselves, but we don't verbalize that to our team or to the people who really need to hear it. So anyway, some thoughts for you.
Oh, dude, Holly, thank you for sharing that. And that was vulnerable, right? So let me give you some vulnerability rep points. High five. Because that was very vulnerable. It's not easy to share that kind of thing, especially something that happened that I could tell that those words certainly like penetrated your heart, of like, just like hit you like a ton of bricks, and you're like, oh man, no, I thought I was the leader that did all the good stuff, and I thought you knew, but, and it's like the but. Yes. And so it's, oh man, that is such good advice and such a good point. Yeah. And so real. It's just so real. It's a practical example of over asking, oversharing, because the conversations in your head don't count. Yes. And that doesn't mean you've done something, because you've had the conversation over and over and over in your head, and it can feel like it's worn out to you. Mm-hmm. But for other people, they're like, how come you never asked me about my family? And you're like, I ask you about your family all the time. But did you really? Because it's, again, and at this point, it's not about facts, right? It's not like, there's not a point, and I'm trying to grab something, all I have is a receipt. But it's like, it's not like you're going to go court stenographer and be like, well, in our one-on-one on this date, we did this and we did this and we did this. It's about what people feel. Yes. What they're really saying is, I didn't feel like you cared about my family, right? You might have asked every single time how my family's doing, but I didn't feel like you cared about them.
That you nailed it, John, and you struck a chord for me, because that's literally why I joined the team at Leadr, was what you just said. Like, so many leaders view their one-on-ones as like people management or project management. But at Leadr, we're trying to turn that on its head, because people don't want to be managed. They want to be led and developed. And that starts with care. They have to know that you care about them. And because that is the foundation of building trust. Care builds trust, and trust builds relationship. And performance and all of that comes out of our relationship with our coworkers and our managers. So you got another soapbox.
Let's go.
Let's do it.
Yeah, care builds trust. And I mean, in the church context, like, what's more being the church than caring for people? Nothing. And sometimes caring for people that are hard to care for.
Exactly.
That's what Jesus did.
One thing I feel like I didn't answer, you asked me such a good question about spiritual growth. And I feel like I didn't answer that because I always lean more towards the like leadership lessons because that's my passion. But
Sure. Yes, give me everything you have. Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, if you are not following Adam Grant on Instagram, I'm going to pull up his Instagram right now because so Adam Grant is an author. He's a professor. He is phenomenal. Full disclosure, in classic Holly fashion, I've never actually read one of his books, but I follow him on Instagram. Okay. So, anyway, everything he posts is just gold. And he posted something I want to read, because I shared it to my Insta story and got a lot of like reactions to it. So I know that this strikes a chord, especially in the church world. So let me read this to you. A company, but in this situation, we could say church, but I'm going to read it as he said it, and then we'll unpack it in a church setting. A company isn't a family. Parents don't fire their kids for low performance or furlough them in hard times. A better vision for a workplace is a community, a place where people bond around shared values, feel valued as human beings, and have a voice in decisions that affect them. Wow. So I know. But what's hard about this is in a church setting, it's the only workplace, right? A church staff is the only workplace where our spiritual, professional, and like social worlds come together. And that's where a lot of times, and I've viewed my teams before as family, but that becomes really unhealthy because I'm not my team's parents, right? Like we're not family. It's a workplace. And in ministry, I think we often get that confused because it is a workplace where all of that comes together. And so I just want to encourage people to think about this, that to shift our view of family to community. And I think, so I've made this mistake before too. I'm thinking about, it was actually this summer, I had a one-on-one with a team member and I wanted to go to a place spiritually that, or even personally, I don't know that it was really spiritual, but because I don't work at a church, I work at a tech company. But we do serve churches. And so sometimes that can blend together. And I have to be really careful about that when I'm caring for the people that I'm working with, because they might not be ready to take that step. And I think even in the church setting, don't assume that your team member is ready to be completely vulnerable about where they are spiritually. And that's okay. It's important that we honor where they are in their spiritual development, and that we don't, like, yes, it's our responsibility to disciple them and care and develop for them, but not to push them. That's the Holy Spirit's job. And it's critical that we don't take on the Holy Spirit's responsibility as a leader. Like, we got to get clarity on the separation of that. And there's definitely been times, I'm an Enneagram 8. I love to fix things. I love to challenge people, and I'll just go there. And I twisted the knife, and it was not good because I needed to let the Holy Spirit do their job. And Holly is not the Holy Spirit. So just another kind of to answer that component of the spiritual component of your question, I think it's important that we are really careful in ministry to understand the difference between family and workplace. And it's confusing and really messy. And I don't know that I have super clear answers for it, but I just think it's important that we really think about that distinction in a ministry context.
So that Adam Grant quote is fantastic. First of all, I love Adam Grant. I'm in the process of reading Think Again right now. That my good friend sent it to me. Yeah. It's really good. I haven't taken enough time to read, but it is what it is. The thing that has helped me think about this is there's a difference between the spiritual community and the 501c3 organization.
Yes.
And the spiritual community can be a family because you don't expel people from that. I'm not, there's some biblical reasons potentially to do that. But when it comes to the spiritual community, you can welcome anybody. It can be a place that Jesus envisioned. And it doesn't matter who you are. Come into the spiritual community. The problem is layered over top of it is a 501c3 organization that has to make money.
Yeah.
It has to have a budget. It has to have standards for who can serve and who can lead and who can do that. And the 501c3 organization is causing so much pain for the spiritual community.
Yes.
And if you look to the 501c3 organization to be your family, you are going to be so disappointed, because it's just like Microsoft couldn't be your family.
100%.
It's like, and you have to tell people all the time, especially new hires, are like, the company's not going to look out for you. I love you, but if you got hit by a bus, you get replaced tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's not what families do. Families mourn and grieve, and you don't go, let's hire a new grandpa. Like that's not what you do. And so
not at all.
You have this overlay of a 501c3 organization that needs to be led with integrity and efficiently and shrewdly in some ways. Of you're going to have to cut staff. You're going to have to make difficult choices. But it's over top of this spiritual community that is so pure and so Jesus-centered. And man, that is one of the impetuses, I guess that's a word, one of the impetuses for this Better on the Inside conversation, because this spiritual community can easily be devoured by the 501c3 organization.
Absolutely, John.
And they have to know their place. They have to know their place. It's not that either is bad or evil or whatever it is. It's just, you got to decide. And leaders, if you're listening to this, you have to decide, what's the place of the 501c3 organization? What's the place of the spiritual community? Because if somebody in your 501c3 organization gets fired because of a moral problem, could they still belong to the spiritual community?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you just had to cut somebody from your staff, right? Lay off some. I mean, it's the pandemic, man. Church budgets are declining. Like, I talk to churches all the time. Our church budget declined, right? If you have to have people that no longer work in the organization, can they still belong to the spiritual community?
Yes.
What kind of culture have you created? And that is a massive test of what we're talking about.
Yes.
Of, are you more, I haven't sorted it out, Holly. The person who sorts this out is probably going to either make $1 billion or have a bunch of jewels in their crown in heaven. I don't know which one, but whoever figures this out is going to really help, because that 501c3 organization spiritual community thing is like,
oh, I know, it's so hard. And I don't know that we will figure it out, honestly. I mean, because on this side of heaven, right? Because I think that's where the brokenness of us as humans comes in, and it's hard, John. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about what the future of the church looks like. And, we don't see the 501c3 organization in the Bible. And so, and it's not that that means that it's wrong. It just means it's different. And so I don't know. I don't know what it looks like either. I don't have answers, but I think
it means it's not eternal.
Yeah, exactly.
What Jesus said, when the gates of hell will not overcome, he's not talking about the 501c3 organization. The 501c3 organization could be dead with a tax change code.
Yes.
That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about the church, the people, because the church is always people. It's this spiritual community. It's this family that is bonded believers for 2,000 years and will for all of time.
Yes.
But the 501c3 organization will pass away, just like however they did church in 1100 AD will have passed away, and how they did church in 150 AD passed away. It's all gone. The model is going to change.
Yeah.
Right. The church. Okay. Now I'm getting into my thesis paper that I wrote. The church is an organism. It's not an organization.
Ooh. And that, John. That's good. I love it.
It just is, because it's going to adapt as people adapt. What people need is different. That's why the printing press was such a big change. And anyway, we could go on forever and ever. But this tension, it's actually helped have conversations when I've had to have difficult conversations with volunteers around, hey, you can't lead for whatever reason that is. Whatever, if it's a moral reason, if it's a qualifications thing. It's going, I'm not telling you that God doesn't approve of you. I'm not the Pope, right? Or there is no Pope. Sorry to my Catholic folks that are listening. But I'm not the one that's the arbiter for God. I'm not telling you that God doesn't approve of you. I'm telling you that you can't serve in the 501c3 organization. I love having you in the spiritual community and want to help you figure out how to utilize your gifts.
That's awesome. Yes.
That has been in a non-heated situation, that has been a good conversation.
Yes.
Just so that people can see I'm speaking from the organization, not condemning, because so often if we ask people not to serve, and if we're going to keep it real, whether it's folk, different churches have different policies around LGBTQ plus folks. Mm-hmm. Different churches have policies about marriage, divorce, drug use,
drinking, all the things.
Go dancing, I don't
dancing,
know, although
what
somebody
to wear.
Right, I'm sure. Women.
Well, women, yes, absolutely.
I mean, we skipped the obvious one, but I love that I jumped to dancing. This isn't. I don't think the minister from Footloose is listening to the podcast. I don't think so.
I love it.
But it goes to the women piece, honestly, so many. And so for so many organizations out there, they have these criteria, and what it can feel like the organization is saying is God doesn't approve of you as you are.
Yes.
And I'm the one that's telling you that. When I just theologically see it this way. If you're a woman with amazing spiritual gifts and you can't lead in that church, that's a 501c3 organization decision. Exactly. We can argue the theology of the spiritual community and all that stuff, whatever.
Yeah.
We can talk about it. But that rejection, and you brought up deconstruction earlier, which is such a hot button topic. And I think you're right. If we're deconstructing the right things, it's really good. But for some people, they have to deconstruct everything to put the right things back in place. That's
literally what an engineer does. I mean, that is literally what engineers do, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a great point. So since we're here, we're definitely digging in. As a woman in church world, that is a disqualifier of leadership in many cultures. And even in cultures where it's okay, or you have a role or whatever, I've personally witnessed the disrespect and kind of dehumanizing stuff that can happen to women. And so this is an opportunity for a soapbox just to kind of speak into what it's been like living in that world.
Yeah, no, it's good. Well, first, I do want to say, in the spirit of leading with vulnerability and humility, I've never been on staff, a paid staff on a church. And so I definitely I was having a conversation with a friend of mine this morning, actually, who she and her husband have planted a church. And she was kind of speaking to the reality that there are so many people out there who are church thought leaders that have never been boots on the ground of the day in, day out of being on a church staff. And so I never want to come across as if, for all of the female leaders out there who are receiving a paycheck from a church and are day in, day out are feeling the difficulty that it is to be a full-time paid staff member on a church. I never want to, come across that I know what that feels like. So,
sure.
But working in organizations that serve the church, yes, as a female, one, I am really grateful for being able to be in different rooms and a part of these conversations, because I do think it's an important conversation to have. I grew up in a complementarian theological background, and so that has been, whether you want to call it deconstruction or just reevaluating or whatever, that's I think a journey that I'm still on, just because so much of that was it was just how I grew up in that theology. And so it probably wasn't until, I guess college that I started to really think about why were there no female pastors on the church that I grew up at? Or why did we never see females talking from stage, and really began to unpack that. And so someone who I think does a really good job on this topic is Katie Cole.
Oh yeah, she's awesome.
Yeah. And what I love about what Katie does is she leaves the theology out of it. So it's like, here's the deal. And this is exactly what you were saying, John, which I think is so powerful, which is the difference between the 501c3 and the spiritual community. And so like her point is, I'm not here to argue with what your theology is. So let's put that aside for a moment, because that's between you and the Lord to like wrestle with and figure out. I will say on that topic, I wish that there were more people who were just open to the potential of their mind changing, or let's say the Holy Spirit doing a work in just challenging them to think differently about, like, let's actually look at what Scripture says and not just take a denomination's theology that we've adopted or a professor that taught us something. Like, let's actually spend time pondering that, because it's critical that we do. So that's the theology component. From a leadership component, what I love about Katie, what she says is like, regardless of what your theology says, you can still allow and steward the female leaders in your church of the gifts that God has given them. And so, and that's exactly what you said, which I think is so critical. It's like, how do we steward the gifts that are in the spiritual community of our church that God has given them and help them develop those? And so that to me doesn't have anything to do with the theology component. I mean, I guess it does. They're correlated, I guess. And so, yeah. I have so many stories of, phone calls of talking to pastors of, like on one of the calls was, somebody said, well, you sure sound like a smart young lady. And I just want to be like, yeah. I'm sorry you're surprised, but I am smart. And, sure, I sound like I'm still or maybe look like I'm still in high school, but I actually have a lot of experience. And if you want to listen, I can help you, or not being invited to events or having a seat at the table. But I think to encourage, any female leaders that are listening, it's easy to get jaded and it's easy to get discouraged, but it kind of goes back to one of the first things we talked about. Make sure you have those mentors and people in your life that are speaking truth about the gifts that you have, and not allowing you to be stagnant in the defeatedness or deflation that you might feel, but encouraging you to step into those gifts and skills and to speak up. That can be challenging when you're sitting at a table. I'm often the only female at the table. And so it's been like that my whole career so far. And so it just to continue to speak truth and grace and let the Lord work everything else out, much easier said than done, but.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, though, the theology just tells you where you steward the gifts. Mm-hmm. And so often I think people use theology as an excuse, both for women should be leaders and women shouldn't be leaders. I think a lot of people say women should be leaders, but then they don't make any intentional move to actually have women as leaders.
Yes.
Or if you're, complementarian, you don't have, I guess it's egalitarian and complementarian, but if you're complementarian, it's like, well, it doesn't mean that women don't have gifts. It just means that you don't think they can lead men.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just the where. That's a where question. So theology isn't an if question. And we need to develop women's gifts because, and I don't if you're somebody who doesn't think women have spiritual gifts, you're definitely not listening to this podcast. But you could not be more anti-Jesus, right? You could not be more anti-Jesus that if you don't think you should develop women's gifts. And so
good.
Wherever you put that, wherever you think that should go, do it, because you have some badass ladies in your church. I promise you, there are women in your church that will do amazing work if they're given the opportunity, and they've been given the same spiritual gifts that the men have. Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna say something that might get me in trouble. I'm just gonna go.
I'm ready.
I'm just gonna go for it. Man, there are so many mediocre men in leadership positions. Yeah. Try a woman. Just try it. Well, okay, even if you're pragmatic, let me just be pragmatic. like we've mined white dudes, and sorry, like this isn't a race thing, but like to get a truly innovative, incredible diamond in the rough from straight white men. Let's just say straight men. We'll just take straight men. From straight men, it's like, we're doing a pretty good job of identifying leaders there. Like, we see it in every aspect of society. We see it in government. We see it in military. We see it in sports. We see it in the economic. Like, we're, and race is a whole separate conversation. But we're doing good. Even if you're pragmatic, there are just diamonds in the rough that are women in your church that, like, oh, she's an executive at Frost Bank, but we don't have her doing anything. Right? Or I mean, I don't want to jump into the homemaker versus job debate, or she stays at home with her kids, but she's CEO level leader.
Yes.
And those women exist in your church. And so like give them, like, help develop their spiritual gifts. It's a no-brainer. Like, even if you're just pragmatic, even if you're just out there and going, my church is struggling, I don't know what to do, giving is down, attendance is down, go to the women. Yeah. That's what Paul did. I mean, that's what Paul did when he went into, Philippi or Ephesus. I can't remember where it was. And he's like, none of the men in the synagogue are doing this. So he went to the women bosses. He went to the ladies and was like, and they're like, yeah, we bankroll this whole thing. You meet here, we pray, we do the whole thing. And it's like, man, if you're in a tough spot right now, look to your women. And again, even if it's in the context of leading other women, they'll grow your church. You might have 80% women there, but they'll grow your church.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my soapbox.
I love it. Soapbox. Yes. Well, because the what you're saying there is we need diversity of perspective. Like that is, so when we hire people or build our teams or volunteer team, whatever it might be, it's just human nature for us to like people that are like us. Right. And so if we're not intentionally building diversity of perspective, then we're going to be doing the same things the same way we've always done them. But when we look to people who have different experiences, who have different backgrounds in every single way, gender, color of their skin, background of career, skill set, age, that's where the magic happens, because people are problem solving with different experiences. And that's the beauty of what Adam Grant said, like that is community. It's shared values and beliefs, but that doesn't mean that we share skin color or gender, or title. It's values and beliefs. So I love what
Come on, Holly.
So
yes.
Good.
Okay, this is so good. I could talk to you forever. We should probably wrap. Because I have a life, you have a life, the whole deal. Before you go, I do want you to plug Leadr. And I just want to say before we do this, Leadr is not a sponsor of this podcast. I mean, Leadr, if you want to sponsor this podcast, the doors are open.
That's
like
right.
the DMs are open. Like I'm not against that. But Leadr doesn't sponsor the podcast. We actually don't use it as a church either. We've gone to stuff. We like Leadr. It hasn't worked out with what we're doing, but it is helpful. Like it is a good solution for people. So I want to give you a moment to plug it so that people can know what we're talking about.
Totally. So Leadr is a people development software that helps you engage and grow every person on your team. So speaking of, solving problems, the problem that we saw was, how do we develop leaders at scale? Like everything we've talked about on this podcast goes back to leadership development. And the reality is people who report to Holly are going to have a very different leadership development experience than people report to John, if we don't have consistency in systems and processes built in our organization. And so we've built a software to help you do that, to make sure that, number one, every single person is cared for and being developed. And then number two, that they're engaged and growing. And so we've got, John, it's insane. Like in just 18 months, we've got over 500 churches on the platform.
Whoa.
And across the country, all different sizes and shapes and denominations. That's one thing that I can say is true, is every single church has a leadership development issue. And it doesn't mean, even if have amazing leader, it's just because it's a continual problem that we'll face forever. As we grow and as people retire or leave or transition, we're always going to need more leaders, more great leaders. And so, you can email me, holly.tate@leadr.com, or go to Leadr. We're a tech company, so we spell it funny. So it's
I was gonna
Leadr.
That's right, leadr.com, or you can email her, holly.tate@leadr.com.
That's right. That is right.
I want to do a plug because it really does help. And a lot of times people are looking for practical solutions. And this isn't the kind of advertising kind of podcast, but I'm also like, if I'm having people on, like, let's talk about what you're doing, because that's hard to separate from everything else. Well, Holly, thank you for joining me. We will have to do this again.
I would love it.
100%. We have to do this again, because we just got started on women in leadership. Like, we didn't even really dig into that. So we got to do that. Thank you so much for sharing. Check out Leadr. It's at least worth checking out. And one of the things it's helped us have the conversation about, even though we haven't started with Leadr yet, is how are we doing leadership development? Mm-hmm. And if you have people, you have leadership issues. So
true. And you know what? The most important thing you just said right there was haven't started with Leadr yet. Boom.
Yeah. Oh, bam. That's why you're the SVP. Love it. Hey, thank you so much, Holly, and we'll drop some of this in the show notes. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, John.
Holly is such a boss. I really love talking to her. Hey, part 2 should be coming soon, and you're not going to want to miss it. Hey, thank you for hanging out with us and joining the conversation. Click the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening to this. You can ask questions by using the voice message function on Anchor or Spotify, or you can email me at John, that's JON, @betterontheinside.com. This podcast is a City Church production and part of the Church Digital Network. All right, love y'all, and I'll see you again soon.